Loneliness increases your risk of death more than obesity or air pollution. That might sound like an exaggeration, just a poetic way to describe a bad feeling, but it's not. It's a measurable biological reality. Social isolation can raise your risk of early death by nearly 30%, according to major meta-analyses, not because loneliness makes people sad, but because it silently chips away at the body like an invisible disease. But here's the strange part. If loneliness is just a feeling, why does it devastate the heart, immune system, and even gene expression like a physical illness? Why does a social experience become a biological threat? To understand this, we have to go back to a strange experiment from the 1950s, one that scientists today would never be allowed to perform. In a quiet, windowless lab at the University of Montreal, a man volunteered to lie in a sensory deprivation chamber. The setup was simple but brutal. Cotton gloves, cardboard cuffs to block tactile input, translucent goggles to blur vision, and complete silence. Within hours, his mind began to unravel. He saw vivid hallucinations, squirrels marching across walls, patterns twisting in space, faces that weren't there. He hadn't taken any drugs. His brain simply couldn't tolerate the silence. In total isolation, perception itself began to break down. What does this tell us? That isolation doesn't just affect the mind, it can destabilize reality. And that points to a deeper contradiction. We are physically independent beings. We can walk alone, eat alone, survive alone, at least for a while. But biologically, we are wired to be interdependent. Our brains track social status, gaze direction, vocal tone, emotional warmth, almost constantly, even when we're not aware of it. The moment those inputs disappear, something begins to panic inside us. But why? Why does the brain, this remarkable organ of logic and learning, react so violently to being alone? Neuroscience may hold the answer. In the early 2000s, researchers discovered something astonishing. When people are socially rejected, the same brain regions light up as when they are physically hurt. The anterior cingulate cortex, a region deeply involved in processing pain, doesn't distinguish much between a broken bone and a broken heart. This became known as the social pain overlap theory. It suggested that the brain treats social disconnection as a form of injury, not metaphorically, but biologically. Loneliness is not simply sadness. It is a neural alarm system evolved to scream for connection, the same way pain screams for safety. But that's only the beginning. New research reveals that loneliness doesn't just activate pain centers, it actually reshapes the brain itself. Chronic social isolation can shrink gray matter in key areas responsible for memory, learning, and emotional regulation. It alters the default mode network, the brain's internal chatter system, making it more prone to negative self-talk and rumination. It changes gene expression linked to inflammation, raises stress hormones like cortisol, and even speeds up cellular aging. So perhaps the deeper mystery isn't why loneliness hurts, but why the brain treats it as such a threat in the first place, and how this ancient biological wiring may now be colliding with the modern world in dangerous, invisible ways. To understand why loneliness cuts so deep, we have to travel back, not decades, but millennia. Our brains were not forged in isolation. They were sculpted around campfires, in whispered stories, in shared glances across the savannah. Homo sapiens did not survive because we were the fastest, strongest, or fiercest species. We survived because we were social. Connection wasn't optional, it was oxygen. We hunted in groups, defended in groups, raised children in groups. Our ancestors' safety, sanity, and survival depended on staying bonded to others. A lone human in the wild was, for most of evolutionary history, a dead human. So the brain adapted accordingly. It evolved not just to think, but to belong. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar famously proposed a cognitive limit to our social capacity, roughly 150 meaningful relationships, known as Dunbar's number. It reflects the bandwidth of the human brain to track emotions, intentions, histories, and hierarchies within a group. And that number isn't arbitrary. It matches the typical size of hunter-gatherer bands throughout history. The very architecture of the brain was shaped by the pressures of social living. The prefrontal cortex, which handles complex thinking and emotional regulation, expanded to keep up with social complexity. The default mode network, the part of the brain active when we do nothing, turns out to be deeply social too. It lights up when we think about others, imagine their feelings, or replay conversations. Then there are the mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that help us simulate other people's experiences, allowing for empathy, imitation, and emotional attunement. Our brains are not solo instruments. They're built like orchestras, meant to play with others. One of the most powerful instruments in that orchestra is oxytocin, often called the love hormone. Oxytocin is released during bonding moments. Hugs, eye contact, shared laughter, even synchronized movement. It's not just for romance or parenting. It flows during any act of trust or closeness. Oxytocin helps lower fear, increase empathy, and build social memory. In ancestral environments, these chemical cues reinforced group cohesion. They helped us feel safe in numbers. But in the modern world, those cues are increasingly absent. Because, here's the paradox, we live in the most connected era in human history, yet loneliness is surging across all age groups. In ancient tribes, solitude was rare and dangerous. Today, it's a default mode for millions. Cities teem with people, yet many feel invisible. Social media promises connection, but often delivers the opposite. Curated isolation. We scroll through highlight reels of other lives while sitting alone in our rooms. We gather followers but lose genuine presence. The brain, expecting touch, voice, and shared space, receives only screens and silence, and the cost is staggering. Loneliness has become a modern epidemic, one so severe that former US Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy called it a public health crisis. Chronic loneliness increases the risk of depression, anxiety, and suicide. It suppresses immune function, raises levels of inflammation, and accelerates the progression of diseases from Alzheimer's to cancer. It even shortens telomeres, the protective caps on our chromosomes, speeding up cellular aging. This is not just emotional suffering. It's a slow, invisible biological collapse. So what's truly at stake here? It's not just the ache of an empty evening or the sting of rejection. It's the fundamental mismatch between our ancient wiring and the modern world. Brains built for tribes now navigate cities full of strangers. Hearts tuned to synchrony now beat in solitude. And unless we understand the deep roots of loneliness and what it does to us, we risk mistaking a profound evolutionary alarm for a passing mood. We risk treating a signal for survival as a personal failure. But loneliness is not weakness. It's a call, one that is echoed in our biology for tens of thousands of years. The real turning point in our understanding of loneliness came not from poetry or philosophy, but from the cold, glowing images of brain scans. In recent years, neuroscientists have begun to map the effects of chronic loneliness inside the brain, and the results are both astonishing and deeply troubling. People who report long-term social isolation show reduced volume in the hippocampus, the region crucial for memory and learning. At the same time, there's a spike in activity within the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, responsible for detecting threats and triggering fear responses. In other words, chronic loneliness doesn't just make you feel unsafe, it teaches your brain to live in a world where safety barely exists. The underlying driver of this transformation is stress, specifically a hormone called cortisol. Normally, cortisol spikes in short bursts when we're in danger, helping us focus and respond. But in a state of social disconnection, the brain perceives constant social threat, rejection, abandonment, invisibility. The result is a prolonged, low-grade fight-or-flight response that wears the body down. Cortisol remains elevated, blood pressure rises, inflammation spreads, and the immune system weakens. Even at night, loneliness leaves its mark, disrupting the architecture of sleep. It fragments deep sleep stages, reduces REM cycles, and leaves the brain less able to process emotion or reset neural circuits. Over time, neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt and grow, diminishes. Emotional regulation becomes harder. Small stresses feel bigger. Neutral interactions feel loaded. The world becomes a little darker, and the mind a little less resilient. These patterns aren't limited to humans. In carefully controlled experiments, socially isolated mice show dramatic changes. They become more anxious, explore less, and groom themselves obsessively. Their brains exhibit lower levels of neurogenesis. Your new neurons are formed, especially in the hippocampus. Some even develop behaviors similar to depression, and the consequences extend to lifespan. Mice who live alone, even in perfect physical conditions, tend to die earlier than those in social groups. It's not the cold or hunger that kills them. It's the absence of others. Faced with this growing body of evidence, some researchers and clinicians are now asking an uncomfortable question. Should we prescribe social interaction the way we prescribe medicine? Should a doctor write a prescription for 2 hours of face-to-face connection per day, a walk with a friend, a weekly community gathering? It may sound strange, but if social connection is as vital as sleep, nutrition, or movement, shouldn't we treat it that way? And here's where things get even more complex. Loneliness doesn't just hurt the brain, it rewires it in subtle, self-reinforcing ways. Brain imaging reveals that chronic isolation reduces activity in the areas linked to compassion and perspective-taking. In other words, the lonelier you are, the harder it becomes to empathize with others. Social signals start to feel ambiguous or, worse, threatening. A neutral facial expression can be misread as coldness. A missed call feels like abandonment. This creates a feedback loop. Loneliness distorts perception, which leads to withdrawal, which deepens isolation. Over time, people become less able to connect even when they desperately want to. It's not a flaw in character. It's biology folding in on itself. What emerges is a tragic paradox. The very state that cries out for connection makes connection feel dangerous. The alarm system meant to draw us back into the tribe can, if triggered for too long, trap us in a maze of mistrust and misinterpretation. This isn't just an emotional spiral, it's a neurological one. And unless we break the loop, loneliness can become a self-perpetuating condition. A brain that once thrived on connection begins to recoil from it. The signal turns against itself. Loneliness, we now know, is not just a personal experience. It's a social phenomenon. It behaves almost like an infection, something that spreads from person to person, silently and invisibly. Psychologists studying emotional contagion have found that loneliness can be socially transmissible. If someone in your network becomes lonely, your risk of becoming lonely increases, even if you're not directly in contact. One person withdrawing, becoming emotionally unavailable, or interpreting others with suspicion, subtly shifts the tone of interactions around them. It creates a ripple effect. Entire communities can become colder, less trusting, more atomized, not from malice, but from the quiet withdrawal of hearts trying to protect themselves. In this way, loneliness doesn't just hurt the lonely, it shifts the social fabric itself. This reality has been faced in extreme forms throughout history. Consider monks in remote monasteries, astronauts in deep space, or prisoners in solitary confinement. Each of these examples reveals something profound. When humans are cut off from consistent connection, They either find ways to adapt through ritual, routine, or meaning-making, or they psychologically fracture. Medieval monks practiced communal silence, but rarely lived alone. Space agencies today rigorously test astronauts' psychological resilience and provide scheduled communications with Earth to stave off despair. Solitude, it turns out, is manageable only when it's chosen and when it's laced with purpose and context. Unwanted isolation, by contrast, is mentally corrosive, and yet the modern world seems to be drifting toward this corrosive solitude. We see it everywhere in remote work that turns homes into digital islands, in vast cities where people know their barista's name, but not their neighbors. Solo aging is rising. Elderly people living alone with no close family, no frequent visitors. Young adults are statistically more connected online than any generation in history, and yet they report the highest levels of social disconnection. Technology has enabled us to work, eat, and entertain ourselves in near-total solitude. On paper, this looks like freedom, but biologically, it's disorientation. The very wiring of our brains expects more than messages and profiles. It expects presence, warmth, eyes that look back, and yet culture continues to glorify the opposite. We romanticize the lone genius, the rugged individual, the self-made soul. We tell stories of strength as if strength means isolation. But independence, as it's often presented, is a cultural myth. No human life begins independent. No society sustains itself through solitude. Even our immune systems, our gut microbiomes, our emotional regulation, all depend on a web of unseen, shared inputs. When we strip away these connections in the name of modern autonomy, we're not becoming stronger. We're eroding the foundation that made strength possible in the first place. In this void, something new has emerged. Artificial companionship, AI, chatbots, digital assistants, holographic friends. Some are marketed as tools for mental health. Others offer simulated romance, conversation, or even love. Parasocial relationships, the bonds people feel toward influencers, streamers, or fictional characters, are now common. They offer a kind of emotional scaffolding, a place to hang one's affections without risk. But do these technologies soothe the wound of loneliness, or deepen it by replacing real connection with imitation? The question remains unresolved. Some users find comfort and relief. Others feel emptier the longer they engage. The danger is not that these tools exist, but that they become replacements rather than bridges to genuine connection. And as always, the burden of isolation is not evenly distributed. The elderly, the disabled, the socially anxious, these populations often face chronic disconnection, not by choice, but by circumstance. Public spaces may be inaccessible. Conversations may be laced with stigma. In some cases, the effort to connect becomes more painful than the isolation itself. Society often overlooks these experiences, treating loneliness as a phase or a weakness. But for many, it is the atmosphere they breathe every day. This brings us to a deeper question. A rising tension at the heart of it all. Is loneliness merely a symptom of modern life, an unfortunate side effect of convenience, mobility, and screen time? Or is it something else? A warning signal, a biological alarm trying to call us back to something ancient and necessary? Perhaps what we're calling a crisis is actually the brain doing its job, telling us we've drifted too far from our design, from the rhythms of eye contact, touch, laughter, and shared struggle. Perhaps loneliness is not a failure of will, but a memory, one that still echoes through our cells, asking us to remember the tribe. Here lies the paradox at the heart of loneliness, and it's one that defies the simplest explanations. Loneliness is not about how many people surround you. It's about what your brain perceives. A person sitting in a crowded subway, attending family dinners, or sharing photos with thousands of online followers can still feel achingly alone. Meanwhile, someone living in solitude, a hermit, a sailor, a monk, might feel entirely at peace, deeply connected to others in thought, memory, or purpose. What separates these experiences isn't proximity, it's perception. Neuroscience now confirms this. What matters most is not the quantity of social interaction, but the quality of connection as registered by the brain itself. This is called perceived social isolation, and its consequences are profound. Studies show that when someone feels socially isolated, regardless of their actual situation, their brain responds in ways nearly identical to someone who is objectively alone. The stress circuits activate, the immune system changes, inflammatory markers rise, sleep fragments, and crucially, cognition begins to warp. The brain becomes more vigilant for social threats. It starts interpreting neutral faces as unfriendly or cold. It rewrites memories with a negative bias, making past social interactions seem worse than they were. The mind begins predicting rejection before it happens, so it withdraws, shuts down, self-protects. The world seems lonelier, so we act lonelier, and the spiral deepens. It's not delusion. It's the brain trying to survive what it perceives as a loss of tribe, but the consequences go even deeper than sadness. Recent findings suggest that loneliness doesn't just feel like a neurological disorder, it can mimic one. Chronic loneliness is now linked to cognitive decline that resembles early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Memory loss, confusion, language difficulties, all can be worsened or even triggered by long-term isolation. Depression too often overlaps. The symptoms bleed together: fatigue, hopelessness, emotional numbness. This overlap creates a diagnostic trap. Doctors may treat the symptoms with medication or therapy without addressing the underlying social disconnect. In some cases, the misdiagnosis delays real healing. Loneliness becomes both a mask and a magnifier for other mental health challenges, hiding in plain sight. And yet, for many, the message they receive is one of failure. That to be lonely is to be weak, broken, unworthy. But this is the final, necessary realization. Loneliness is not a character flaw. It is not a weakness of personality or a failure of will. It is a survival response, honed over millions of years. Just as hunger signals lack of food, and pain signals physical harm. Loneliness is the brain's way of sounding an alarm. You are too far from your people. Return. It's not an insult. It's an invitation. A reminder that we are built to connect, not simply as a preference, but as a biological necessity. To ignore that signal is to ignore the very architecture of our evolution, but to listen to hear what it's trying to say might just be the beginning of healing, both for ourselves and for the world we share. The most hopeful discovery about loneliness isn't found in grand solutions or sweeping societal changes. It's in the small, often overlooked, acts of everyday connection. New research reveals that even subtle gestures, a genuine smile, a shared meal, a kind word, a moment of eye contact can begin to reverse the brain changes driven by chronic loneliness. These tiny signals of safety and belonging send powerful messages to the nervous system. You are not alone. When we receive those signals, the brain begins to relax. The amygdala, hyperactivated by perceived social threat, starts to calm. Oxytocin is released, reducing stress, boosting empathy, and rebuilding the sense of trust that loneliness had eroded. Slowly, the biological alarm begins to quiet. Certain group activities accelerate this process. Volunteering, group singing, dancing, or even synchronized walking can have measurable effects on mental health. These aren't just feel-good hobbies. They are neurologically repetitive. When people move in rhythm, sing in harmony, or engage in shared purpose, their brains enter states of synchrony. Oxytocin increases, cortisol drops. The default mode network becomes less self-focused, more open. In these moments, the boundary between self and other softens, and connection becomes possible again. Not just emotionally, but chemically. Loneliness, in essence, is slowly unlearned. Even digital solutions, so often blamed for worsening disconnection, can help, but only under certain conditions. The key isn't the technology itself, but how it's used. Passive scrolling through social media rarely soothes loneliness. But when technology is used to create presence through voice calls, video chats, or emotionally rich messaging, the brain often responds as if to physical proximity. Virtual spaces that foster genuine empathy and shared vulnerability can light up the same networks as real-world connection. The difference lies in intention. Asterisk, are we using screens to avoid each other, or to truly meet? Asterisk, meanwhile, therapeutic approaches are proving powerful. Cognitive behavioral therapy can help individuals recognize and reframe the distorted perceptions that loneliness creates. Through guided self-awareness, people can begin to challenge the internal narratives that tell them they're unwanted, unworthy, or doomed to be alone. Mindfulness, too, plays a critical role. By learning to observe thoughts without judgment, lonely individuals can create space between perception and reaction, allowing new interpretations to form, grounded in compassion rather than fear. Some cities are now applying these insights at the level of urban design. In London, conversation benches have been installed with simple signs: "Sit here if you'd like to chat." In Japan, loneliness hotlines, staffed by volunteers, offer a voice in the dark for those who have no one else to call. In the Netherlands, grocery stores have created slow lanes where elderly customers can talk with clerks without being rushed. These aren't massive policies, they're subtle changes to the environment, designed to send a signal. Asterisk, you matter, and we see you. Asterisk, here, at last, is the scientific clarity. Loneliness is not permanent. It is not a fixed trait or a life sentence. The brain is plastic, adaptable. Given the right conditions, it can rewire. The amygdala can calm. The prefrontal cortex can relearn trust. Neural pathways shaped by fear and rejection can be overwritten. With safety and care, the healing of loneliness doesn't require a crowd. It requires presence. Real, attuned, intentional presence, because the true antidote to loneliness has never been more people. It has always been more presence, the kind that listens, the kind that looks into your eyes, the kind that reminds your nervous system you are not alone anymore. That, in the end, is the quiet power of being human. We break, but we can also be rebuilt, not in isolation, but together. Somewhere deep in your brain, far beneath thought and language, there is a signal, a silent pulse. It doesn't speak in words, it speaks in longing. It flares not when you're physically alone, but when something in you senses disconnection. It's ancient. It was shaped not in silence, but in stories. Stories told around fires, held in laughter, sung across generations, whispered in the dark when the wolves were near. It's a voice built from a time when isolation meant danger, when survival was a shared act, when every heartbeat was part of a rhythm larger than the self. And though the world has changed, become louder, faster, more crowded, and yet more distant, that voice still lives in you, still waits for someone to listen, still asks the same question. Asterisk, where is your tribe? Asterisk, loneliness hurts, not because something is wrong with you, but because something is right. Because your brain remembers. It remembers belonging, even if your body has forgotten. And that pain, unbearable as it feels, is not a flaw. It's a compass, a biological map pointing home. We were never meant to be strong alone. The myth of independence may serve economies or egos, but it betrays biology. Strength, real, lasting strength, has always come from the village. the circle, the shoulder leaned on. To feel loneliness is not to be weak, it is to be human. And to feel that ache is to carry within you the most human of all calls. Asterisk, come back, be seen, be held, be known. Asterisk, because sometimes all it takes is a moment. One moment of eye contact, real, soft, unhurried, and the brain begins to settle. One shared breath, in song, in silence, in grief, and the amygdala quiets. One hand reaching toward another, and something ancient exhales. That is the power of presence. It doesn't require words. It doesn't require perfection. It only requires willingness to be with, not above, to see, not judge, to reach, not retreat. And so, maybe the real question isn't how to escape loneliness, but how to listen to it. What is it asking of you? What part of you still longs for the warmth of others, for the pulse of recognition, for the soft assurance that you are not, and never were, meant to carry this life alone? If one moment of eye contact can calm the brain, if one shared breath can quiet the amygdala, then what might happen to your body, to your mind, to your future, if you simply chose to reach out?